The sun had barely climbed over the far hills when the calm of the plains was broken by the slow ringing of the ranch bell and the sound of horses walking across dry soil. It was the same quiet morning sound folks in the small frontier town knew well, yet that day felt heavier, like the land itself was holding a secret. The cool wind pushed dust across the open fields and carried the smell of wood smoke from the nearby cabins. In that wide country where cattle ranches spread farther than the eye could see, most men walked with tough shoulders and loud confidence. But one man kept his eyes toward the ground. He lived a simple life, worked harder than many, and asked nothing from anyone. Town folks called him the quiet single dad, a man who never spoke unless necessary. It always wore a gentle look when his little boy ran toward him with dusty boots and a bright smile. No one knew much about his past, only that he had arrived from the far south with very few belongings and a small child who appeared to be the center of his world. People talked, as they always did in lonely towns, and some formed unfair opinions based on his quiet ways. In a place where toughness was praised and silence was mistaken for weakness, the quiet man did not fit the usual picture of a ranch hand. He spent most evenings working behind the barn, repairing wood, mending harness straps, or crafting toys for his boy out of smooth branches and leather scraps. Sometimes his child laughed loud enough to echo off the distant hills. And in those moments, something in the father's tired eyes softened, showing a love deeper than words. Though he'd never joined the loud gatherings outside the saloon or boasted about cattle counts, people could see he was skilled, patient, and careful with every task. Yet those same qualities made him a target for rough young cowboys, who believed respect must be earned with a sharp tongue and a loud show of pride. Those cowboys were not truly evil, but they carried too much idle time, too much pride, and too little understanding of what quiet strength looked like. They whispered among themselves, teasing and pointing, whenever the single dad walked by with his child in his arms. But he ignored them, choosing instead to focus on his work. He believed silence was safer than arguments, and that his purpose was to raise his son with peace, not anger. Still, the gossip spread across the ranches like dry grass fire carried by the wind. Some ranch hands warned him kindly, telling him that rough cowboys respected only those who fought back, but he simply thanked them and went on with his chores. There was something else none of them knew. Every time he stepped beyond the barns and walked toward the creek with his son, he glanced at the distant ridges where tall cliffs stood like watchmen of the land. He looked that way with knowing eyes, as if expecting someone or something. For reasons unknown to the townsfolk, he felt safer with his back turned to town than facing it. His boy sometimes asked why they rested near the old pine trees instead of joining town gatherings, and the father simply hugged him and said, "Some things are better kept quiet until the right time." People assumed he feared trouble, but the truth was more mysterious. He was not alone in that land. There were eyes watching over him from places where horses left no sound, and where men knew how to disappear behind trees like shadows slipping into smoke. There had been signs. Long before anyone realized it, ranch riders sometimes found strange markings near the creek, as if someone had left a silent warning. The local sheriff once followed a set of unusual tracks that vanished near the old riverbed. Hunters claimed they felt someone trailing them, yet never saw a soul. But no one connected those silent movements to the quiet single dad. To them, he was only a soft-spoken man who worked for survival, not someone who might hold a hidden link to a powerful group known for their bravery, loyalty, and strong code of protection. The Apache people who lived beyond the hills were spoken of with respect and caution. They moved with skill, rarely seen unless they wished to be seen, and only a few people knew their deeper stories. No one imagined that the quiet father had a history tied to them. Trouble began when jealousy mixed with pride one afternoon behind the barn where cattle ropes hung in saddles, dried in the sun. The Cowboys had spent the morning bragging about their skills and daring stories, and as they drank from tin cups, they turned their thoughts toward the man who never spoke back. They wondered why he never showed fear, even when they mocked him. They convinced each other that he needed to be taught a lesson, believing it would make them feel stronger. Yet they did not know that strength was not always loud, and that some men carried storms in silence. When the father walked behind the barn to fix a broken wheel, they followed with hardened looks and proud steps. His little boy was inside the cabin napping. Unaware of the clouds forming outside, the quiet dad heard their footsteps but did not lift his head. He thought perhaps they only passed by, but when they surrounded him, he knew the moment he had tried to avoid had arrived. Even then, he did not show anger. He only spoke with calm words, telling them he wished for peace and wanted no trouble. His gentle voice made them even more determined to break his calm spirit. They misunderstood his patience for fear, never imagining that somewhere beyond the edge of the ranch, unseen figures were watching as if waiting for a signal that only the land itself could hear. At that very moment, a soft rustle came from the tree line near the barn, though none of the cowboys noticed. The wind shifted, birds fell silent, and the air felt different, heavier, like something powerful was stepping toward fate. The father lifted his gaze not toward the men, but toward the distant hills. And for a heartbeat, his eyes carried a message no one understood. Something ancient and strong was coming closer, moved by loyalty older than the ranch itself. That quiet moment was the thin thread between danger and the unknown. The next sound they heard was not a shout or the stomping of horses. It was something quieter yet filled with warning, a sound that meant someone else had arrived. The cowboys did not know they were no longer alone, and that the man they believed to be weak had protectors hidden in shadows of earth and sky. Something was about to unfold that would change everything on that ranch land. The plains held their breath as the story turned toward a path no one expected. The quiet single dad kept his back straight as the cowboys closed in, though inside his heart beat faster than he wanted to show. He knew trouble had finally reached a point where silence could no longer protect him, yet he still believed patience and calm words were better than fists. The men circling him spoke with sharp tones and proud smirks, asking why he always walked alone, why he thought he was better, and why he never defended himself like a real ranchman. He tried to explain that he came to the land only for honest work and for his son, not to take anyone's place or any rancher's pride. They ignored every word, their pride louder than their sense. What none of them understood was that his quiet life was not shaped by fear, but by past lessons carved deep into his spirit. Lessons that came from both loss and unexpected loyalty. Before he arrived at the ranch land, life had taken him through long miles of rough country. He had once lived near old trading routes where different tribes, settlers, and lonely travelers crossed, sometimes helping each other and sometimes turning against one another. He had learned how to ride, build fires, track weather changes, and stay out of dangerous paths, not because he wanted adventure, but because life left him with no other choice. He learned how to observe before acting, how to listen before speaking, and how to see danger long before others noticed it. He also learned that not every fight needed fists, and not every threat required a loud answer. His son was born during the hardest season of his life, a season that almost broke him, yet gave him a reason to keep walking. The bond between them was the strongest thing he carried, stronger than fear, doubt, and loneliness. When he traveled north with his small child, he passed through land, watched over by Apache warriors. Most travelers feared the idea of crossing near their territory. But he learned that respect could build bridges even without shared language. One cold night near a dry riverbed, his son became sick from cold winds, and he struggled to keep him warm with only thin blankets and a weak fire. The child cried faintly, and he felt helpless. In that moment of fear, he sensed movement near the rocks. Instead of panic, he placed his hand over his child and stayed still, knowing running would only worsen things. From the darkness stepped two Apache figures, calm and silent like the night itself. They did not speak his language, but they saw the sick child and understood everything without words. One of them handed him warm herbs wrapped in cloth and gestured how to prepare it. The other built a fire quickly using dry branches that he himself had not seen in the dark. They stayed nearby all night, without touching his supplies or asking anything. When the child finally slept with quiet breathing, tears formed in the father's eyes, not from fear, but from gratitude. From that moment on, he built a deep, silent respect for them, understanding that true strength did not need loud threats or harsh steps. In return, The Apache learned he was not like others who crossed their land with greed or false courage. When he prepared to continue his journey, they left small signs on trees and stones, showing him safe paths. He never forgot their silent protection. As he finished his long journey and reached the ranching territory, he hoped to settle somewhere peaceful. The ranch owner gave him work without asking many questions, impressed by his skills. He built a small cabin behind the barn, not for hiding, but for quiet family space. Still, he did not forget the hills or the silent shadows he once met. Every time he looked toward the ridges, it was not fear that filled him, but a quiet understanding that someone still watched over him from afar. Not as his servants or guards, but as people who once shared a night of humanity under cold stars. So now, with the cowboys around him, he stood calm, not because he could not fight, but because he believed a peaceful path always came first. One of the cowboys pushed him lightly with his shoulder, expecting nervous eyes or shaky steps, but he stayed balanced. Another poked his chest and told him his quiet ways made him look weak. He wanted to tell them that real strength was measured by what a man protected, not by how loud he spoke. But he knew his words would not reach closed minds, so he simply said he needed to return to his child. The cowboys blocked him, irritated that he refused to react. They wanted him to be angry, scared, or broken, but all they saw was steady breathing and patient eyes. That made them even more restless. Just a short distance away, his young son woke from his nap and looked out the small cabin window. He saw his father behind the barn and waved with a sleepy smile, unaware of what was happening. The dad wished he could wave back, but he did not want to alarm his child. He prayed inside his heart that the moment would pass without harm. Yet before anything worsened, a soft sound drifted again from the tree line. This time it was different, like a signal carried by the wind. One cowboy turned his head slightly, confused by the sudden stillness of nature. The rustling leaves seemed to move with purpose, and the horses near the fence lifted their heads with alert ears. The quiet dad felt a familiar presence, the kind he once felt near the dry riverbed where strangers helped him without asking for anything. He took a slow breath, not in relief, but in recognition of something he hoped would never be required. The cowboys did not see what was coming, nor did they know that they were being watched, not from anger, but from loyalty. The Apache warriors moved like part of the earth itself, unseen by careless eyes, yet fully aware of every risk. They had not forgotten the man who honored peace and respected their way of life. They also knew how dangerous pride could become when, mixed with ignorance, the father wished with all his heart that they would not appear or get involved. He did not want anyone hurt, nor did he want the cowboys to think he called for help. He feared misunderstanding more than injury. His goal was to protect his child, not begin a conflict between ranch workers and Apache people. Yet loyalty has a way of choosing its own path. Somewhere near the barn wall, a shadow shifted slightly, unseen by the men who stood blinded by pride. The father lowered his eyes to the ground, trying to think of words that could calm the situation. He wanted to explain that silence was not fear, that some men carry storms inside not to destroy, but to survive, that protecting a child was a battle itself. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a sentence, a faint sound, like a soft signal whistle, reached his ears. It made his heart sink with a strange mix of hope and worry. The wind changed direction, pushing dust across the yard, forming lines on the ground like silent marks. The cowboys stepped back slightly, unsure why the air felt heavier. One of them laughed nervously, trying to shake off the feeling, but no one joined. For the first time, silence fell over all of them. Not from fear, but from something unknown, settling around them like a warning from the land itself. The father slowly lifted his eyes, not looking at the cowboys, but toward the tree line where he once found safety. He knew something was about to unfold that would change how every man on that ranch viewed strength, respect, and loyalty. His heartbeat matched the quiet tremble of the leaves, knowing the moment he wished to avoid had already begun, whether he accepted it or not. The plain ground between them held a heavy pause, as if the land waited to see what kind of men they would choose to be when truth stepped forward from the shadows. The wind settled for a long moment behind the barn. as if the land itself waited for someone to speak or step away. The quiet single dad kept his breathing calm because he understood how fast a moment like this could turn dangerous if pride controlled it instead of reason. He looked from one face to another, hoping at least one of the cowboys would soften and decide that walking away was better than forcing a man who never wanted trouble. But their eyes shifted like men unsure whether to continue or step back, and that uncertainty itself became part of the danger. No one wanted to be the first to show doubt, yet none of them felt as confident as before. The father tried again, in a voice steady but not threatening. He told them that every man carried his own battles, and that silence did not mean weakness. He explained that a father working every day for his child did not need to prove his worth with fists or harsh words. One cowboy almost looked convinced, but the tallest among them stepped closer, unwilling to let go of his pride. He warned the father that a man could not keep living on ranch land without showing where he stood among men. The father stayed calm, saying that he stood with hard work, honesty, and peace, and that he meant no disrespect to anyone. But the cowboy didn't like that answer because it did not match what he believed strength should look like. A sudden movement near the creek caught the father's eye. Something small and near the grass. It's not enough for the cowboys to notice, but enough to confirm that the moment was being watched from a distance. That sight filled him with mixed feelings, because he knew the presence of the Apache warriors could shift the story into a path that would affect many lives. He never expected them to follow him all the way from the trading routes to this ranch, but now he understood that they did not see their act of help as something that ended in one night. They continued to honor something he never asked for, but deeply respected. He carried their trust like a hidden responsibility. His son, unaware of any danger, stepped outside the cabin and rubbed his eyes with small hands. The boy called for his father, and the moment everyone turned their heads, tension loosened for only a few heartbeats. The father smiled gently at his child, telling him to go back inside and wait. The boy nodded, though he looked confused, sensing the strange mood outside. He lingered for a moment before returning inside, closing the cabin door with slow hands. The father wished he could hug him and promise safety, but all he could do was keep standing without, showing fear. The cowboys took the boy's presence as another reason to continue their challenge. One of them claimed that raising a child alone made the father too soft, and another said no man should live without showing where he belonged. They mocked his quiet ways, calling him strange for sitting near creeks and staring at ridges instead of joining saloon talk. All the while, the father kept calm because he knew anger only fueled more conflict. Inside his heart, he repeated a prayer taught to him long ago, hoping the land would guide them toward peace. He wanted the cowboys to understand that every man carried history, and that not all stories were loud or simple. Meanwhile, far beyond their sight, the Apache warriors were not the only ones silently following the moment. The sheriff, who had been finishing paperwork inside his small office near the general store, noticed the uneasy behavior of some ranch riders earlier. Although no one said anything clearly, he sensed a growing concern around the man everyone called the quiet single dad. The sheriff was older and more experienced than most men in town, and he believed intuition was as important as evidence. He grabbed his hat and slowly began walking toward the ranch. He didn't rush, but his steps carried purpose, as if he expected something to unfold. Back at the barn, the father finally shared some of his journey, not in detail, but only enough to remind the cowboys that assumptions could mislead a man. He told them he once traveled through land where respect was earned by acts, not noise, and that he learned real strength from people who spoke little but protected much. The cowboys paused, surprised by his unexpected tone. But the tall one still argued that life on the ranch required showing authority. The father replied that authority without wisdom harmed more than it helped. The cowboy didn't like how calm he sounded, feeling as if he had lost control of the situation. Somewhere behind the tree line, quiet signals moved between hidden figures. It wasn't a call for battle, but for preparation. The Apache warriors understood that misunderstandings between settlers and their people could lead to consequences no one intended. They respected the father for his peaceful way, but they would not allow harm to fall upon him or the child he loved. In their culture, loyalty was not something that faded with time or distance. Every warrior watching carried memories of the night. They saved his son and saw a father's heart stronger than fear. The father knew that the more time passed, the thinner the line between peaceful conversation and unnecessary harm became. He wanted to pull the situation into safer ground, but every reply he gave only made the pride of the Cowboys feel more challenged. Without raising his voice, he asked if they ever wondered what stories other men carried, what roads they walked before arriving at the ranch, or what reasons guided their choices. One cowboy hesitated and said that in their lives, men rarely spoke about feelings or past sorrows. He admitted that sometimes silence scared them because it reminded them of things they didn't want to feel. That one small confession opened a crack in the wall of pride, though it didn't stop the tension. The tallest cowboy grew impatient with what he called slow talk, insisting that proof of strength must be seen, not spoken. He believed the father's refusal to show anger meant he hid some form of cowardice. The father explained that protecting his son was his only concern, that fighting other men did not help him become better in that duty. He tried one more time, telling them that a man who had carried his child through storms, hunger, and miles of unknown land needed no further test to know his worth. At the very moment those words settled, the sheriff approached the ranch quietly, unseen by anyone near the barn. He stopped near a broken fence board and listened carefully, understanding the situation through tone rather than shouting. He sensed the seriousness of the moment and thought through what authority should look like. He believed that a community had the responsibility to teach fairness, not encourage unnecessary tests of pride. He prepared himself to step forward when the time was right, but he knew speaking too early could trigger a surprise reaction. The Apache warriors also waited, hidden but alert, ready to act only if harm threatened the father or the child. They observed not with anger, but with wisdom passed through generations. They hoped that human understanding would rise before confrontation. They knew that misunderstandings between worlds grew faster than crops and were sometimes harder to stop than wildfire and dry wind. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the boy looked out again through a small space between the wooden boards. Clutching a small wooden toy horse his father had carved, he watched the men outside and sensed something was wrong. Though he didn't know why there was no laughter or friendly talking, he wished he had someone to ask. Someone who could explain why grown men sometimes acted like storms ready to break without warning. His young heart felt a quiet fear. Back outside, the father remained steady, not stepping back and not raising his hands. The air felt heavier by the second, as if every word spoken added invisible weight. None of the conflicts resolved, and no one yet understood how deep the moment would reach. The land, the hidden warriors, the sheriff, the father, the cowboys, and even the child were now tied together in a tension that could lead toward peace or pull everyone into a path they might regret. The next move had not yet been made, and no one knew who would decide it. The wind grew cooler, as if waiting for one final breath before the true conflict revealed itself. The sheriff stopped a few paces behind the barn, placing one hand on the rough wooden post as he listened. He did not interrupt yet, because he understood that if he stepped too soon, pride might flare harder than fire on dry weeds. He watched the quiet single dad stand surrounded, still calm, while the cowboys shifted restlessly like horses sensing thunder. He knew the ranch had seen disagreements before, but something about this moment felt different, heavier, almost tied to forces beyond the fences and cattle trails. The sky itself seemed to dim slightly, as if clouds drifted closer, though none could be seen. The tall cowboy finally stepped forward again, told the father that a man could not keep avoiding answers forever. He said they needed proof that the quiet dad had the strength to stand among ranch workers. The father looked him in the eye, and his voice carried a steadiness that seemed to pull silence over the barnyard. He explained once more that he respected every man here, that he worked with full loyalty, and that no harm had ever come from his hands. He said strength was not always measured in how loud a man could shout or how hard he could swing, but how well he could protect what mattered. The cowboy tightened his jaw, then said the father must show what he was capable of, not with fists, but through a challenge. This caught the father off guard, not because he could not accept a test, but because he feared how far such tests could lead. The cowboy pointed at a wild stallion in the far corral, Strong and restless horse no one had yet been able to ride without being thrown. The stallion kicked dust into the air, its eyes flashing with a warning no less sharp than the tension in the barnyard. The cowboy claimed that if the quiet dad could saddle and hold that animal long enough to prove his courage, then they might see him differently. It was a dangerous challenge, and even some of the other cowboys looked uneasy. But no one spoke against it. Because they believed ranch life required tests like these. The father glanced toward the cabin where his son waited, then toward the hills where he felt the unseen eyes of the Apache watching. He knew that refusing would only make things worse, and he did not want this moment to shape his child's future with fear. So he agreed, but with one request. He asked that no one harm the horse, and that the challenge be completed with respect, not pride. Most nodded without care, but one cowboy frowned, saying respect was earned, not requested. The father walked toward the corral with slow steps, feeling the ground shift like each step carried a greater risk than the last. The stallion snorted and pawed the earth, its powerful muscles tense, ready to fight any rope or saddle. The father climbed through the fence, his hands slow, movements calm, not forcing anything. He spoke to the animal softly, not as a command, but as a promise that he would not hurt it. The cowboys watched with narrow eyes, expecting him to rush and be thrown flat on his back. Instead, he knelt near the horse, letting the animal smell his hand. The stallion grew still for a moment, confused by such patience. Then the father placed the saddle on carefully, whispering words that no one else could hear. Slowly, he mounted, gripping only what was needed, not more. The stallion reared high, kicking and twisting, trying every possible way to throw him off. The father held on, not with brute strength, but with balance and steady breath. Dust shot into the air as hooves scraped the ground. The corral fence shook when the horse slammed against it. Several cowboys shouted in surprise, impressed despite themselves. The father leaned forward, then backward, controlling his weight with skill learned through long travel and hardship. After a long struggle, the stallion finally slowed, breathing heavy, accepting his presence. When the father slid off, he bowed his head to the horse, proving respect was never weakness. For a moment, the tension lowered. Even the tallest cowboy stared without a word. But pride is not an easy thing to surrender, and he stepped forward again, saying the test was not enough. He accused the father of using tricks and demanded to know why he always looked toward the hills. He said there must be something hidden, and if the quiet dad truly lived with honesty, should explain who he expected out there. The father's heart tightened, and he said he owed no one that story, but that he never brought danger to the ranch. That only fueled suspicion. The cowboy claimed that maybe the quiet man was secretly tied to something that could threaten their land. The sheriff finally stepped forward then, revealing his presence. Everyone turned to him in surprise. He spoke calmly, telling them they had pushed enough, and that a man did not need to reveal his entire life to earn the right to work and raise a child. But the tall cowboy disagreed, saying trust could not grow without full truth. He insisted the father speak, or he would never be seen as part of the ranch. The father tried to answer respectfully. He also knew speaking too much could endanger the silent bond he once shared with the Apache. His silence now came not from fear of the cowboys, but from fear of betraying those who once saved his child. While voices rose again, one cowboy noticed something near the far ridge line. A faint figure stood among the trees, silent and still like carved stone. Another figure appeared, then a third, all dressed in traditional Apache clothing. They did not show weapons, but their presence alone was enough to stir unease. The cowboys backed up slightly, murmuring in confusion. The father closed his eyes, his worst fear now forming into reality. It was no longer a private tension, but a moment where two worlds were facing each other, without words. The sheriff whispered that no one should make a sudden move. The tall cowboy, however, whispered that this proved everything. He claimed the father had brought danger and that they were now surrounded. But the father stepped forward, telling everyone that these men were protectors, not threats, and that they had never harmed an innocent person. The tall cowboy did not accept it and said that no one could trust those who hid in shadows. The father's voice shook for the first time, not from fear, but from frustration and sorrow. He said that shadows sometimes protected better than those who walked proudly in sunlight. The Apache warriors remained still, like guardians waiting for a sign. The air turned cold with suspense, and even the horses sensed the change. The sheriff tried to calm everyone, saying fear caused people to see danger where there was none. But the tall cowboy argued that the ranch must be defended. Tension stretched so tight that even silence felt like it might break. The father stepped between both sides, holding up his hand as if he could stop storms with his palm. His son pushed open the cabin door and ran toward him, calling for him with shaking voice. The father lifted his child into his arms, and every protective instinct inside him rose like a shield. The warriors shifted slightly, sensing the child's fear. The cowboys watched, unsure if they were witnessing danger or loyalty. The wind began to blow harder, whipping dust across the field, and the father knew the moment where everything changed had finally arrived. Whether peace or conflict came next would depend on words not yet spoken and choices not yet made. The father held his child close against his chest and stood between both sides as the wind carried dust across the open ground. For a moment no one moved, and the world felt strangely quiet, like even the sky paused to see what kind of men would shape the outcome. The Apache warriors remained still and calm, their gaze steady but never angry, as if they wanted to remind everyone that they came to protect, not harm. The cowboys glanced at each other, unsure if they should step back or stand firm. Their pride still rested on their shoulders, but their fear now softened it enough for doubt to speak. The sheriff raised one hand and asked everyone to listen instead of letting fear decide anything. He spoke with a slow, firm tone, explaining that no man should be judged without knowing his full story, and that fairness did not belong only to those who spoke loudest. He reminded the cowboys that they had seen the father work every day, with their every storm, and raise his boy with gentle hands. He also pointed at the Apache warriors and said their calm entrance showed they had not come to attack, but to stand with someone they respected. The father breathed deeply, knowing the time had come to speak with full honesty, not because he feared punishment, but because he wished for peace for his son's future. He explained that while traveling across rough land, he once met the Apache during a night when he feared his son would not live through the cold. He said those warriors saved the boy's life and stayed by him with silent loyalty, expecting nothing in return. He told the cowboys that he carried gratitude in his heart and never forgot their kindness. He did not reveal details of their ways because respect demanded silence, not because he hid something dangerous. He said the Apache watched over him only to be sure no harm reached the child they once protected, not because they wished to interfere with ranch land. The tall cowboy looked unsure for the first time. He lowered his eyes, remembering how he once admired stories about honor and loyalty, and forgot them when faced with his own pride. Another cowboy whispered that maybe they had pushed too far and judged without understanding. The father did not ask for forgiveness, but instead told them everyone sometimes makes wrong assumptions when they fear the unknown. He said the important thing was to learn, not blame. The sheriff looked toward the Apache warriors and nodded respectfully, thanking them for showing patience. The tallest warrior stepped forward slowly, placing one hand over his heart, then toward the father and child. Though he spoke little, the message was clear. They recognized the father not as a weak man, but as one worthy of respect for living with quiet strength. The cowboys, who once teased him now, saw the truth behind his silence, and their expressions softened with a mix of regret and new understanding. The tall cowboy finally stepped forward, clearing his throat as if it took effort to speak honestly. He admitted that he let pride steer his actions, and that he believed loudness made men strong. Now he understood that strength could also be found in steadiness, kindness, and quiet loyalty. He apologized to the father, and though the apology felt rough, it was real. The father accepted it with a small nod, saying that peace mattered more than any wound to pride. With tension easing, the Apache warriors slowly stepped back toward the trees, showing trust by turning first. Before they disappeared between the pines, one warrior paused and looked back. Meeting the eyes of the young boy who watched from his father's arms, he gave a faint nod, as if marking a promise that the child would carry forward a link between two worlds, not a wall between them. The boy lifted his hand gently in return, even though he did not fully understand the meaning. The father smiled softly, grateful for a moment that held deep respect. The sheriff placed a hand on the father's shoulder and told him he had a place in town if he wished to stay. Not because of pity, but because he had proven his heart belonged there. The ranch workers stepped forward, offering help to rebuild trust and understanding. Some even asked if he would teach them how he handled the wild stallion with patience instead of force. The father agreed, saying that horses, like people, responded better to calm guidance than harsh control. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the town's opinion shifted. The quiet, single dad was no longer seen as strange or weak. People began to notice how skilled he was with tools, how he repaired broken gear faster than most, and how he guided his son with tenderness and strong values. His son grew more confident because he now saw others respecting his father, and he felt proud of his heritage, both from the ranch life and the loyal bond to the Apache protectors. The ranch grew more peaceful as men learned to think before judging and listen before speaking. The wild stallion, once feared, became a trusted ranch horse under the father's care, showing that even the most restless spirits could find peace with patience. The cowboys who once mocked learned lessons they never forgot. They became more willing to understand strangers, knowing that every man carried a past shaped by silent battles. They eventually helped build a small play area near the cabin for the boy, using wood and rope to craft swings and climbing spots so he could grow, laugh, and feel safe. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, the father sat with his son on a hill above the ranch. They watched orange light stretch across the land where cattle grazed peacefully. The father told him that no matter where life led, kindness would lead him farther than anger, and respect would earn more than pride ever could. The boy leaned against him, saying he wanted to grow strong like his father, not with fists, but with heart, though the Apache did not return often. The father sometimes found small signs left near the creek, like feathers or carved stones, marking silent greetings. He always answered with a small offering of herbs or smooth stones, knowing that bonds built with truth did not fade. The hills remained quiet but not empty, carrying unseen friendships like whispers carried by wind. The town became known not for loud ranch tales, but for how people learned to bridge differences. Travelers sometimes heard the story of a quiet single dad who once stood alone behind a barn, only to reveal he was never alone. They learned that being watched over by Apache warriors was not a mark of danger, but of honor earned through a single act of gratitude and respect. In the end, the father raised his son in a place where trust was rebuilt, where two different worlds met without fear, and where a man who once walked with silence now walked with acceptance. He never changed who he was to fit others, but instead helped others grow by showing a different way to live. His story reminded everyone that true strength did not need to roar across the land, because sometimes the strongest hearts were the ones that beat quietly, guided by love, loyalty, and peace.